Ladies and gentlemen, you're all very welcome here to the Seven Oaks for the October lecture. And on behalf of Carlow Historical and Archaeological Society, I bid you a very warm welcome. This evening, the subject for the lecture is the Graney Ambush 1922, and it's going to be given to us by James Durney. James is an author and a historian. He works with the Genealogy and Archives Department in Kildare County Council. He has written over 20 books on Irish history, ranging from Irishmen in Korea and Vietnam to social housing and the revolutionary period. He's also written about Irish American gangsters. He's a consultant, has been a consultant on several TV documentaries. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome James here and his wife this evening. And James, you're most welcome, and we thank you for coming to give us the October lecture. So without further ado, I'll ask James to come forward. Thanks, James. Great to have you.
Yes, and thank you for inviting me here to speak. First time to address any crowd in Carlow, so I hope you'll enjoy the presentation tonight. Of course, it's the Graney ambush, one of the most controversial ambushes in this locality in any part of the Revolutionary War, whether the War of Independence or the Civil War. A pretty brutal time in our history. And the Graney ambush epitomises the brutality of the Civil War, how bad things really became after, the glory of the War of Independence and that, and gaining our freedom from Britain and that, and then it all disintegrated into a horrible, bloody year of violence, and it affected everybody in the country, probably a bit more than it affected people in the War of Independence. And the death toll in the Civil War is far higher for that short period than it was in the War of Independence. But we've come on from then, we've come a long way since that period, and now we feel that we can actually talk about the Civil War, where when a lot of us were growing up, it was something nobody ever spoke about. When we went to school then as well, it wasn't even taught in our schools, it was just glossed over. The revolutionary period ended at the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921, and then no one spoke about what happened afterwards. We just rushed on to the Second World War, and that whole period of our history was forgotten. But it has always interested me, is how people cope with trauma and with violence in their everyday lives and that. And a lot of people would say that I'm a military historian and that, and I would tend to disagree that I'm a social historian, telling the story of people, ordinary people who happen to be involved in wars, whether it's World War I, World War II, the Irish Revolutionary period, or any of the wars of the 20th century. And I have a big interest in all those periods, and that's why when I go to read about things like this, Carlow wasn't in any of the history books, Kildare wasn't in any of the history books, it was all Cork and it was Dublin and it was Tipperary. And we rarely had an insight into what was happening in our own localities. So when there was nothing to read about in books and that, I decided then that I would correct history as such and write about my own locality in all those periods, and that's what I've been doing for the last 20 or 30 years, hoping that someone else would replicate it in every other county, and then we would have such a great oral history or social history of our own areas, and not just dependent on historians from Britain like Charles Townsend, who were fantastic historians, and Carlton Younger, and that. These were the ones who were writing about the War of Independence and the Civil War, and there's no Irish historians writing about when I was growing up. But that's been corrected now. There's a huge amount of Irish historians writing about our own history, and that's great. So, as we come to the anniversary of the Graney ambush, I think it's time we spoke about these things and recognised how these things happen and the people that were involved in it. So on the 24th of October 1922, an anti-treaty column ambushed the National Army tender at Graney crossroads on the Castledermot to Baltinglass Road. 3 National Army soldiers were killed and 6 wounded, 1 mortally. And since that fateful day 100 years ago, the full story of the Graney ambush remains to be told. And in preparing this presentation, many participants on both sides have been identified and their part in the Graney ambush explained. Now you can see this is the first time this has ever been really seen in public, is this painting by James Durney from a tie. And he vividly portrays the Graney ambush, and if you're familiar with the roads, this is what it would have looked like on that fateful day in 1922. The War of Independence effectively ended with the signing of the truce on the 12th of July 1921. And on the 6th of December 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed, giving 26 counties of Ireland what was known as a measure of freedom, while 6 north-eastern counties remained within the United Kingdom. The treaty immediately split the Irish Republican movement, and a civil war between the new provisional government of the Free State and anti-treaty elements of the IRA began in June 1922. The IRA in the quiet counties of Carlow, Kildare and Wicklow had only begun to be effective in the spring of 1921, when divisions, brigades and battalions were organised. These units were only beginning to act as a cohesive army by the time the truce was signed. And with martial training continuing during the truce period in places like Duckett's Grove, the IRA was in a better military position in 1922 than it had been previously. And because of this, violence in the Civil War increased dramatically. The ambush took place at a sharp bend in the road, at a spot where 4 roads converge, known as Graney Cross. It is, even today, a busy junction on the road from Castledermot, County Kildare, to Baltinglass, County Wicklow. In charge of the National Army detail were Commandant Hugh Kenny and Lieutenant Edward Nolan, both of Baltinglass, County Wicklow. The driver of the Crossley tender was James Hunt from Carlow. Its other occupants were Sergeant John Scully from Grey Cullen, Privates James Murphy from Baltinglass, Private Edward Byrne from Bagnallstown, Patrick Allison from Harristown and Kildare, and John Nolan and James Martin. The tender left Baltinglass around 12 noon to travel to Athy, but ran out of petrol between Castledermot and Athy. Commandant Kenny sent 1 man on a bicycle with dispatches to Athy, and a motor brought out fuel. They decided to abandon their original trip and, having refuelled, to return to Baltinglass through Castledermot. The tender stopped at the post office for about 5 minutes and then proceeded towards Baltinglass. The soldiers had spent over an hour on the roadway between Athy and Castledermot, and their presence was undoubtedly noted by anti-treaty supporters. When the national troops began their journey back to Baltinglass, more than 20 Republicans were already in position in and around Graney Cross, waiting to ambush the unsuspecting soldiers. On the 27th of September 2017, Executive Librarian Mario Corrigan, photographer Donald Higgins and I met with several local historians, Thomas and George Corrigan, George Stevenson and Sharon Green, at Graney Cross to film and map the ambush site. Thomas Corrigan provided a hand-drawn map. And it was a cold, rainy day, as you can see, unlike the 24th of October 1922, which was dry with a high of 10 degrees. The attacking party used Richard Thorpe's house on the right-hand side of the road as their main position. Mr. and Mrs. Thorpe were held in one of the cottages occupied by Republicans. For about an hour before the ambush occurred, people passing along the roads in the locality were held up in order to take cover in nearby houses. A wedding party was recorded as among those held captive, and some labourers working on the roads in the area were also held up and taken to a place of safety. As the tender was passing Thorpe's house on the right-hand side, left in our photo, a volley of shots was opened on it from the cottage with no effect. Men were also positioned at Hunt's cottage at the cross, behind the low wall, and at all rooms at Paddy Doyle's forge. A second volley quickly followed. The driver, James Hunt, was hit and he lost control of the tender, which ran up on the ditch at Cassidy's garden, between 10 and 15 yards from the cottage. Colin Kenny, sitting in the front with the driver, was thrown out of the tender to the right into the ditch, where he crawled to safety. The rest of the occupants fell out onto the road, and Colin Kenny was wounded when he attempted to return fire. Members of the ambush party also fired from behind a low wall at a place called the Pound. Hit by a deadly fusillade of bullets, Privates Edward Byrne, James Murphy and Patrick Allison had fallen out onto the road where they were hit by more bullets. Edward Byrne was hit 4 times and died from a wound above the heart. James Murphy was shot in the shoulder. Patrick Allison was hit twice, in the head and stomach. All the rest of the troops were wounded, and except for Lieutenant Nolan, who was wounded in the back and face, were seriously injured. All the roads had been blocked by trees, and a small group of National Army soldiers were caught in a virtual death trap. The attackers outnumbered the National troops by over 2 to 1, and they fired on across the tender using rifles, Lewis guns and revolvers. The IRA column burnt the tender and took away all the arms, 8 rifles, except Commandant Kenny's revolver. When the ambushers had left, some of those who had been held up hurried off to Castledermot and Baltinglass, bearing the sad news. Mrs. Hunt brought water to the injured, and it was said that a local family refused to provide water to the injured. But this could be assumed from Ned Nolan's statement, which said, "I asked one of the ambushers to get me a drink of water in the house opposite. He promised to do so, but did not come back." A young lady dressed the wounds of the injured soldiers before a local doctor, D.P. Kenna, arrived at the site. And this is the map drawn by Thomas Corrigan on the day we visited Graney ambush site. And if you look at where the cross marks the spot, it's where the bodies of those who were killed or had died at the spot were found. The Nationalist and Leinster Times of the 4th of November 1922 reported on one of the most remarkable features of the Graney ambush, which was that canine instinct, or the dogs, the local dogs. The moment the rifle firing and the bomb thrown began, all the dogs of the district, curs and well-bred, left the locality and did not return for 2 days. The ambush took place on Tuesday afternoon, and some of the canines remained away till Friday, so a correspondent tells us. The bodies were brought to the Carlow workhouse, which had recently been taken over by the National Army. Richard MacDonald, coroner for County Carlow, held an inquest in the boardroom of the workhouse. Brigadier General Niall MacNeill represented the National Army, and Terence Stiles, solicitor, appeared on behalf of the military authorities. A grieving Mary Byrne, the mother of Private Edward Byrne, identified his body. She told the inquest, "I have seen the body of Edward Byrne, now lying in the hospital of the workhouse. He is aged 16 years and had been in the National Army for 3 months. He is my son. I last saw him alive on Thursday last. I also identified the body of Patrick Allison." John Murphy from Kiltegan in County Wicklow said, "I have identified the dead body to the right in the hospital as that of my brother, James." Lieutenant Edward Nolan then gave his evidence of the ambush, adding that at no time were they asked to surrender. Brigadier General MacNeill in his evidence said that it was an ambush absolutely impossible to escape. "I would not attach any blame to the men for surrendering if they had got an opportunity to do so, and I believe that the firing of several volleys in succession did not gain any military advantage for the attackers and was not justified." The The coroner's report returned a verdict that the men were willfully and brutally murdered by an ambush party. And this is the registration of deaths of the 3 soldiers. Patrick Allison died of shock and hemorrhage caused by destruction of brain and destruction of skull. Edward Byrne died of a wound of heart caused by gunshot or bomb. And James Murphy died of shock due to hemorrhage. The funerals of Privates Murphy and Byrne took place on Thursday, 26th of October, at Kiltegan and Clonmore respectively, with full military honours. Almost the entire Baltinglass garrison attended the funerals. Private Allison's funeral took place that same afternoon at St Mary's Cemetery in Carlow. James Hunt, driver of the Crossley tender, died of his injuries in the Carlow County Infirmary on the 28th of October, 2 days after his comrades had been buried. His funeral took place at the family burial ground at Kilquegan. All the business establishments of Carlow were closed during the period of the funeral. James Hunt was possibly a member of the Killinure Company of the IRA during the War of Independence, although he would only have been a teenager at this time. He may have been a dispatch runner or an associate to the local volunteers, as Rathmore IRA leader Patrick Nolan claimed he received dispatch from young Hunt 2 weeks before the truce in July 1921, which prevented their arrest by the Black and Tans. James Hunt joined the National Army on the 6th of June 1922 as a transport mechanic. His parents received an allowance of 7 shillings per week and a gratuity of £25, later increased to £50 in final settlement of their claim for compensation. After service in World War I, Patrick Allison had served in the IRA in Ballymore Eustace, and while on the run in County Carlow, he used the alias Pat O'Hara. The Nationalist and Leinster Times of the 25th of March 1922 carried an apology from Republican James Curran of Dunshane, Harristown, withdrawn an accusation that Patrick Allison was in the Black and Tans in Carlow. A partial dependence gratuity of £30 was granted to his family. A National Army census was taken on the 12th to the 13th of November 1922. The return for the Curran Military Hospital listed 5 men wounded in the Graney ambush, as we can see here. Colonel Kenny, Lieutenant Nolan, Sergeant John Scully, Private John Nolan, and Private James Martin. Sergeant Scully spent 5 months in hospital recovering from his wounds. The photo of the men in the hospital exists, and one of your members here, John Kelly, is in possession of that photograph, and I believe it's to be used in a new book on the revolutionary period in Carlow. Sergeant John Scully was from Chapel Street in Craigcullen in County Carlow, and he survived. During the War of Independence, John Scully took part in drill parades, raids for arms, carrying dispatches, raid on excise office and the burning of RIC barracks. He took part in the capture and burning of a British military lorry at Carlow railway station and was captured as a result in April 1921 and interned until the 17th of August 1921. And this is his letter asking for compensation. John Scully enlisted in the National Army on the 27th of February 1922 in Carlow, and during the Civil War served with the 20th Infantry Battalion until his discharge medically unfit on the 24th of April 1924 due to ill health, wounds and a dislocated knee occurred at Graney Cross. He received a gratuity of £60 and a yearly pension of £25, and he was unfit for work for 2 years. This is a statement of his case by the medical board with details of all of his wounds. Edward Nolan died on the 28th of March 1975 in Baggot Street Hospital in Dublin, 53 years after being wounded at Graney. Ned, as he was known, was a former member of Carlow Brigade, IRA, and at the time of the ambush was recorded as a well-known footballer. So we're now to those in the ambush party. The anti-treaty unit responsible for the attack at Graney were known as O'Connell's column. Thomas O'Connell was an uncompromising Republican, a veteran of the War of Independence. A native of Eden, Derry, County Offaly, he had come to Carlow to work as a cabinet member. O'Connell was Vice Commandant of Carlow Brigade before and after the treaty. At the beginning of the Civil War, he was arrested in early 1921, or in early 1922, as the Free State began to round up those who they thought would be a thorn in their side once the Civil War broke out. And he was held in the military detention barracks at the Curragh camp known as the Glass House. He escaped from the Glass House and subsequently went on the run in and around his own area, his own local area of Carlow. O'Connell's column consisted of about 20 men and included Larry O'Neill, Tipperary man who had led the Carlow Active Service Unit in 1921. O'Neill had been wounded and captured along with 7 other members of his column at Ballymurphy in 1921, which resulted in the deaths of 3 innocent civilians and 1 volunteer. The action decimated the fledgling Active Service Unit. And this is an IRA training camp at Duckett's Grove, a photograph taken in the truce period in 1921. Larry O'Neill is in the photograph along with Jim Rice, James Lillis and John Scully. And we can see on the other side then the Carlow Brigade. The shaded part was transferred to North Kildare in August, September 1921. Many of the Kildare units were attached to Carlow Brigade during the War of Independence and again in the Civil War. Lawrence O'Neill was transferred from Dublin Brigade to Carlow Brigade in September 1920. As we said earlier, he was wounded and captured in April 1921 and sentenced to 15 years in prison. After his release from Dartmoor prison in the General Amnesty in January 1922, he organised units in the Carlow area and during the Civil War was Commandant of the Carlow Active Service Unit. He claimed the Brigade Officer Commandant Thomas O'Connell was present at the ambush. O'Neill maintained the column stayed together until Dump Arms Order in 1923, which ended the Civil War, but he did not safely return to his home until a year later, in May 1924. James Lillis was the only member of O'Connell's column who was executed for his part in the ambush. He was captured at Borris and convicted on being in possession of a rifle and ammunition and of having taken part in the Graney ambush. James Lillis was born in Chapel Street, Newbeg. He was shot by firing squad on the 15th of January 1923 in the coal yard of Carlow Barracks. His remains were reinterred in Dunleckney Cemetery, Newbeg in 1924. After his execution, he would have been buried near where we were looking at, in the coal yard. The last letter of James Lillis to his brothers said, "Remember me to Tom Kinsella and the miller, and all the boys on the column. I am dying as a soldier and a man. Get all the boys in the mill to pray for me. The priest told me I'm going to heaven, so no need to fret. Goodbye forever. Your fond brother Jim." Another of the column members was Christopher Murphy, born in Donegal, County Carlow in 1889. He married Elizabeth Dooley, a servant of Simonstown, Moon, in September 1918. Christopher Murphy served with the Irish Guards for 4 years in France during World War I. On return to Ireland after his demobilisation, he worked for Colonel Frederick Fitzgerald Carroll of Moon Abbey as a gardener. Colonel Carroll was from the Royal Army Medical Corps and was a licentiate in midwifery and died in London in 1932. Christopher Murphy made an unsuccessful application for a military pension. His application read, during the Civil War period, he claimed service against National Army forces at Baltinglass, Graney and Tull. Christopher Murphy died at his residence at Simonstown on the 6th of August 1964 and was buried at Moon Cemetery. His obituary in the Leinster Leader of the 21st of August 1964 said, Mr. Christopher Murphy, who died at his residence in Simonstown, Moon last week, aged over 70, fought in the 1914 war. After the war he returned home, joined the 5th Battalion of the Carlow Brigade of the IRA, and took a prominent part in the War for Irish Independence. A gardener by occupation, he was employed for many years in Moon Abbey. He was a highly esteemed and popular figure in the area. His wife and married daughter Mary survived him. After the Requiem Mass celebrated in Moon Cemetery, or Moon Church by Reverend J. Costello, CC, he was interred in Moon Cemetery. John Shannon of Knockrow claimed in his 1952 pension application to have been one of the Graney ambushers. He said, I was with Brigadier O'Connell and 16 others in the Graney ambush near Carlow. He claimed to have a German Mauser rifle while taking part in the Graney ambush. Again, his obituary was in the Nationalist on the 23rd of May 1975, which says the death occurred at his residence, Bridge House, Knockrow, Borris, recently, of Mr. John Shannon. Deceased was in failing health for some time. As a young man, he was an active member of E Company, 4th Battalion Carlow Brigade, Old IRA, during the 1919-21 period, and suffered internment in the Curragh. A farmer by occupation, he also turned to journalism and was attached to the reporting staff of the Enniscorthy Echo, and later joined the People newspapers in Wexford, where he worked for many years. His remains were removed to Ratanat Church on Thursday, and burial took place the following day, following Requiem Mass in the adjoining cemetery. Reverend Liam Reid, CC Borris, officiated. Mr. Shannon is survived by his wife, sons, daughters, sister, nephew, and friends. James Rice of Straw Hall was OC of A Company, 1st Battalion Carlow Brigade in the War of Independence. During the truce period, he served at the brigade training camp at Duckett's Grove. On the outbreak of the Civil War, he joined Carlow Active Service Unit and took part in the Graney ambush. This is a photograph taken by Richard Fitzpatrick of the 1966 Easter Rising commemoration in Carlow, and shows a marching group of Old IRA and Common Man veterans. Among them are Jack Scully, survivor of the Graney ambush, and Jim Rice, one of the ambushers. A man who had possibly inflicted injury and death on Jack Scully and his comrades. A grandnephew of John Scully, John Kelly, one of your members, said that Jack bore no animosity towards Jim Rice, his former adversary. Mick Woods of Russellstown Park, Palatine, was one of the ambush party and was the man who, according to a family story, burned the National Army vehicle to make it unusable. He joined the Irish Volunteers in 1918. Mick Woods died on the 11th of May 1947. He received the Guard of Honour from Old IRA and Common Man comrades, and a volley was fired over the grave at Bennekerry Cemetery. And these photographs show Mick Woods sitting in the car, and then the staff of Hennessy's Garage, well-known garage in Castledermot. Mick Woods is the tall man in the middle, and on his left, his brother Paddy, who was interned for 18 months during the Civil War. The hunt for the O'Connell column continued, and on the 5th of December 1922, two men, Seamus O'Toole of Rathdangan, County Wicklow, and Miles Carroll of Borris, were shot dead crossing a field at Sheehan near Gary Hill. They were on the run at the time, along with three others: Ned Keane from Castledermot, Hugh O'Rourke from Tinnahealy, and Charles Byrne from Michael. Two of these men were captured, with Charles Byrne making good his escape, and he received a plaque to the memory of men of the Carlow Brigade who were killed between 1916 and 1923, and then a little part of a song that was written about those men who were killed. In the county of Carlow, 2 rebels were sought for, 2 brave Irish heroes who loved Erin Keane. With the guns of the British that they lent Dick McCarthy, they were both assassinated at Carty's in Sheen. Ned Kane escaped from Tulla Barracks with the help of Paddy Cosgrave, the former officer commandant of Castledermot Company IRA, and then an officer in the National Army. He brought in a uniform for Ned to aid him in his escape. Paddy Cosgrave died in December 1983, aged 89. He was a cousin of former Taoiseach Liam Cosgrave, who attended the funeral. The leader of the Carlow Active Service Unit, Tomás O'Connell, at the age of 24, was killed in a car crash at Levittstown, Graney, on the 31st of August 1924. Because of his Republican activities, he had only recently returned to his home place in Edenderry. A steel cross marked the spot where he died, but it disappeared some years ago. O'Connell was well respected in Edenderry, and his funeral witnessed a huge turnout, including men from both sides in the Civil War. It says a prominent local leader dead from his obituary. His numerous friends and many of his political enemies heard on Sunday last of the death of Thomas O'Connell, well known in the Black and Tan days, and since as a prominent local leader in the IRA. His death, as the appendix report shows, was tragic in the extreme, and his passing will be regretted by many, even those who did not agree with him. The troubles of this generation will long be forgotten. In September 1952, members of the old IRA unveiled a headstone and monument in honour of Tomás O'Connell. Thomas Derrick, TD, Minister for Lands, gave the oration. It is probable that few in attendance were aware that O'Connell's older brother Patrick, now commemorated in the family plot, died on the 30th of November 1917 near Cambrai, France, during the Great War. He was aged 19. And these are members of the O'Connell family Edenderry on the 21st of September 2018, with the flag which covered the coffin of Tomás O'Connell, and which is still held proudly by his family. In the heady days following the centenary of the Easter Rising, we looked beyond the War of Independence and the Civil War. There had been nervousness as we approached the 100th anniversary of our struggle for independence, but it proved unnecessary. State and local commemoration events were honoured in a mature, dignified and inclusive manner. But there has always been an omission. Memorials to IRA volunteers killed from 1916 to 1923 mark our countryside, and rightly so. However, there are few, if any, commemorating the deaths of hundreds of National Army soldiers killed in the Civil War. These soldiers were members of the National Army of a new democratic nation state. They were our sons, brothers, husbands, just as much as those who died on the Republican side. Many of the National Army soldiers were veterans of the War of Independence. Some, like Christopher Murphy, were veterans of the First World War. Others had joined up in a time of economic turmoil. Edward Burn was just 16, because some had been caught in the militaristic times. They died to uphold the treaty and the will of the people expressed in June 1922 at the general election. But their sacrifices were effectively forgotten. Even Tomás O'Connell had a roadside memorial, but the men who were killed at Graney had nothing. Even some of their graves have disappeared. Sadly, the state and the Irish Defence Forces are equally guilty in neglecting to appropriately commemorate fallen Irish soldiers on their home soil. We commemorate those who died in the UN service, and we forget over 700 National Army soldiers who died during the Civil War don't have any commemoration for them. So with this in mind, in Castledermot at 3 p.m. on the 22nd of October, there will be an unveiling of a commemorative board to commemorate the 4 men who died at Graney, serving in the National Army. It will be unveiled by Senator Mark Wall of Castledermot, whose relative died during the Civil War of disease or illness. And this will finally help begin the healing process and also help to recognise those from the national side who died in the Civil War. So you're all welcome to attend, and if you do, there's a little special bonus apart from a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, maybe a sandwich provided by Clare County Council. You also get a booklet on this presentation that I'd written for the military sword after doing this talk some years ago in Castledermot. So, as an added incentive, you'll be able to read about what we just spoken about tonight. So hopefully we might see somebody who was there Saturday in Castledermot. And thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much for attending. And I know there was a bit of a mix-up on the dates. This was the talk was meant to be, but that was my fault. I get to the age now that I kind of forget things. And I forgot that I committed to this event. If anybody wants to add anything to it, or anybody wants to ask a question about the ambush, or just even have a chat about the events, you're very welcome. And again, thanks to Helen and Richard and Gary and them for inviting me here to speak. And again, thanks for turning up, because this is why we go out and talk, because people are interested and want to listen. So it's really, that's the reason why we do it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James, for a fascinating lecture. James invites any questions that anybody may have, and I'm sure he'll be happy to try and answer them. Not try, probably answer them. Have we any questions?
Just one thing about, I was in contact with James over the last couple of weeks, and Edward Byrne wasn't from Baltinglass, he was from Clonmore.
Yeah, I think another relative rang me last week as well and corrected that as well. Said to me that I think it's a chap from Kyle OC. To know. Yeah. See, mostly what you get is in the information. You're only working on the information supplied, which is what this, as you know yourself, what it says in the newspapers, which aren't all entirely correct. And again, when guys are joining up, you get the details, then you know where they're from or where their parents are from at the time, which ends up with the mistake. This is where they are originally from. So hopefully we can rectify that at some stage.
Do we have any other questions? Yes, Arthur.
Is there any recriminations on the men that led up to trouble?
Well, really, only the guy that was James Lillis was the only one executed for his part in the Graney ambush, and that was because he was found under arms as such. And if you were found under arms after the proclamation of 1922, you could be executed. And because he was found with a rifle and they'd known that he took part in the ambush, he was executed. And Ned Nolan, in the statement, he recognised a lot of them. And for years, many people in the area knew who was involved in the ambush. But because it was all quite localised, people didn't really speak about it. And the two guys that were killed near Sheen then as well, they would have been involved. And again, they probably weren't given any chance to surrender. They probably opened fire first and then probably asked to surrender, but at that stage they killed two and they captured two more, and then one of them escaped. But there were the National Army were looking for them. They knew who they were. They knew that Tomas O'Connell was the officer in command, and they were trying to catch them in that. But most of them got away, you know, and the Civil War, of course, ended then a couple of months later, and kind of everything was forgotten about for a long time afterwards. And there was a lot written about the Graney ambush over the years. I first came across it about over 20 years ago, and I've been researching it ever since. And it takes it takes a long time to put these together. I tried to name everybody that was involved in the ambush and all those that were involved in the actual, that were in the tender, the National Army tender as well. So, trying to piece it together, participants, and then of course the photograph in 1966 where you see them all together, enemies and former foes, and they're all marching together, and everybody just kind of gets on with life in that. But it kind of hit the community hard. It was really a kind of black cloud hanging over the community for a long time, because it was quite localised. It was local people killing local people. And that, unfortunately, was what the Civil War was all about.
Ellen?
Was it a premeditated ambush, or was it just that they saw them on the road and gathered together and attacked, or had they planned already? Did they know they were coming?
No, there's supposedly there's a lot of local stories that one of the lads said was meeting a girl in Castledermot, and that's why they were at the post office and that. And they were delayed then, of course, on the road, and O'Connell's column was active in the area. So to maintain that the information came from Castledermot that these guys are going back, the same road and that. So they were waiting for them. So it was just an opportunity really that they took to ambush them. There was no plan really to ambush, because it wasn't a regular accordance, but as you say, it wasn't premeditated, it was just a spur of the moment, but it was quite successful. But because they were delayed and they broke down for petrol, then they went into Castledermot, the post office, and they hung around for a while. It gave the ambush party plenty of time then to ambush ready for them on the way back. And that's what happened, it's sort of catching them. But it was a lot of work went into it, as you can see, with the blocking of the roads.
Sorry, I just was wondering, just in regards to the fact of the ambush, it was basically shoot to kill. Was that quite common at that particular period in time? Or, it wasn't just to hold them up and to get arms or anything like that? It wasn't the directive?
It just seems to be a shoot to kill at this stage. The Civil Wars get quite bitter then. It's after the death of Michael Collins that things really, really get bad then. Because once Collins is killed, the gloves are off, and men are being shot down, they're not given a chance to surrender. You have the executions coming up then as well. Found under arms are going to be put up against the wall and executed. Internment, there's something like 13,000 people interned during the Civil War, while during the worst excesses of the British in the War of Independence there was only 5,000 people interned. So it gets really bitter once Collins and Griffith dies, and as you say, it's a shoot to kill. They're not getting any opportunity to surrender. And the bad thing about it is that when they're on the road, they're actually shot at while they're lying on the road. Most times you get an opportunity to, if you're wounded, to surrender, and they don't really do that. And it's only Colin Kenny pretends that he's actually dead, and they think he is dead. That's how he survives, really. So it's a really vicious ambush. And one of the worst in the general area.
Eddie?
Just the sketch you had of the actual scene where the bodies were found, they seem to be spread out a bit.
Yeah, they were taken. I can go back to that now. Yeah, they would have been the houses that are around the general area, and I think one body was found on the road, and the other bodies, we see the crosses, were taken into the houses, so it would have been mortally wounded at the time and probably passed away, because when Brigadier General McNeil comes out, he finds one man on the road and he finds two laid out in the house, each house laid on the table with that. So they probably, the guy on the road was probably killed instantly, the other two were mortally wounded and then maybe died a couple of minutes later. So that's how they're in different areas. But that was drawn by George Corrigan, or Thomas Corrigan, the day we went out to map the ambush site. And the idea was that we're thinking that we would put a memorial on the road. But it's too dangerous to pull up, it's very busy, it's too dangerous to pull up. It'd be liable to get run over, like if people were stopping to have a look. So that's why they decided then to put it in Castledermot, it would be safer as well. So it is still a very, very busy cross, but it's a perfect ambush spot. Like, when you look at it from a military point of view, it's perfect for an ambush.
There were experts at ambush and stuff. IRA,
Oh yeah, like they've learned, through, you can see the illustration, they've learned through the War of Independence. But by this stage, they're very cohesive now at this stage. That's why, as I said earlier, the death toll in the Civil War is bigger because they're better at what they're doing.
Any other questions?
Just explain that picture. Explain where the current Castledermot is, where the landmarks.
Which? Yeah, this is Thorpe's house this is where the car would have come originally and was fired up from Thorpe's house, and then careers up on the left into the ditch and turns over, and the men fall out, and then they're fired up from the pound here and from the other house there as well, at them while they're on the road.
Where did the ambushers head for after the event?
Sorry?
Where did the ambushers head for after the event?
Probably head for the hills. Like, I mean, this was an active column that was roaming around. This was an active service unit. What we would have termed a flying column at the time, but what the IRA would always refer to as an active service unit. These would be there was up to 20 men living off the land and living in safe houses. And these are the guys that the catch at Sheen then as well. They had been in a safe house. There was about 8 of them or something in a safe house. And the National Army surrounded the area. One group got away, and then the second group was where the 2 lads were killed, and the 2 others captured as well. But it would have been used in safe houses all around the area. That would have been again perfected during the War of Independence. The problem was that their former comrades in the National Army knew where they would be hiding, knew where they get safe houses and that. And again, that's why you have 13,000 people arrested in the Civil War and only 5,000 in the War of Independence, because the British don't know what they're looking for, and it's trial and error with them. But in the Civil War, the National Army know what they're looking for. They're former comrades and they know where they are. So that's how they round up so many people in the Civil War than they do in the War of Independence. Because it is a war of brothers, a war of sisters, a war of husbands, and they all know one another, unfortunately.
Any further questions?
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you, James, and not just for the lecture, but for the fantastic slides here as well. It makes such a difference to have really good slides. I now call on the Secretary of the Historical and Archaeological Society, Paul Curran, to propose a vote of thanks.
Basically, just before I say on behalf of the here and the Historical Society, James Hunt was my grandfather's first cousin, and I remember seeing a photograph. I think it was the Hunts in Bestfield, 18 Bestfield, the very last house here. That Jack Timmins, who married Bridget Hunt, lived, and they were very close. All the homes were very close to each other.